Hi, welcome to the fourth lecture in our inaugural series for the By4 Collective. It's a pleasure to introduce Darren Newbury, Professor of Photographic History at the University of Brighton. Darren's research interests relate to the relationship between photography, history, politics, and cultural memory, with a particular focus on African nations and South Africa specifically. In 2020, Darren received the Royal Anthropological Institute Photography Committee Award for his contribution to the study of photography and anthropology. He's co-edited important volumes on this topic of photography in Africa, including the African Photographic Archive in 2015 and Women and Photography in Africa in 2021. He's also the author of several books, including Defiant Images, Photography and Apartheid South Africa, and People Apart, 1950s Cape Town Revisited, about the photography of Brian Heseltine. Most recently, he published a fascinating monograph, Cold War Photographic Diplomacy, the US Information Agency and Africa. That came out just last year. Thank you to Darren for joining us, not least of all because he's a very busy man. This weekend he's leaving the UK, heading to New York to do further research in the UN archive. So it's very kind of him to give up his time to speak to us today. Over to you, Darren. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for that introduction. Just give me a moment to share my screen. Can I just check that everybody can see that okay? Yes, brilliant. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Tom. I'm kind of interested to hear you introduce this as kind of about progressive and emancipatory kind of uses of photography, which I'm not quite sure I can live up the kind of images I'm going to show you can live up to that to either of those terms entirely. Hopefully they speak to them in a kind of interesting way. But I'm essentially talking about US government photography. So we'll hold for discussion to what extent the images might be considered progressive or emancipatory. There may be some in there that we could think of in those terms. So as Tom said, I'm going to talk on a particular aspect of US government photography that comes out of the book that I published last year, with a particular focus on the civil rights photography that the US government was producing in the sort of late 1950s through the 1960s. And it was one of the ideas they attached to the way in which they were representing civil rights for international audiences was this idea of democracy in action. So that's the kind of connection to the connection to the kind of theme of this series, and you'll kind of see how how that was understood, how it was interpreted within that this kind of body of photographic work. Okay. Right. I need to do that to move on. Sorry. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the kind of broad context of both of the kind of production of these photographs, but also of the wider kind of project that this particular element comes from. As Tom said, it's part of a larger study that I've done looking at the US Information Agency in relation to the Cold War period, and I'm kind of using this idea of photographic diplomacy, drawing on kind of ideas of kind of public diplomacy, the idea of using photography as a means of communicating, of the US government communicating with international publics elsewhere in the world. And it's important, one of the important things to bear in mind in terms of the images that I'm talking about is all of these were produced, I think all of the images that I'm showing today are produced in the US, but they weren't produced for the US. They were all produced for international audiences, and they weren't circulated within the US itself during this period. They're available now in archives in the US, but they weren't. The work of the US Information Agency was, specifically for work to be distributed internationally. It was not for work, any images being circulated within the US itself. Now, most of, most people who've engaged with photographic history will have probably come across the US Information Agency in relation to the book, the exhibition, The Family of Man from 1955, and its subsequent international tour, the kind of the versions of that exhibition that were sent across the world and shown in multiple countries in the years following 1955 over quite some period, and now installed permanently in Luxembourg. That is often, up until the point I began working on this project, that was pretty much all I knew about the US Information Agency, and is often seen as the first and last word in US photographic diplomacy. It's I tend to think of the Family of Man as this kind of magnet that's kind of sucked in most of the scholarship around US government photography of that period, to the kind of neglect of some of the other work that was going on and the work that carried on afterwards, and actually quite a significant investment in photographic activity by the US government running through the period, certainly through the period I'm talking about here. So it's important to kind of position it in relation to that, into that kind of broad sort of photographic historical context. It's also, whilst the research I've done is specifically on the work of the US Information Agency, it was part of a kind of post-war period and connected with other kinds of photographic activity, particularly there was a kind of sharing of photographs, of kind of ideas around the use of photography, the formats in which it was distributed with the United Nations and with UNESCO particularly in the early years. That kind of changes over time. But I've kind of the image you can see there is from UNESCO's Courier magazine, and there's an element of that kind of work in the kind of mid-50s, which one might think of, and this is probably for another discussion, as informed by an idea of post-war anti-racism, responding to the kind of ideas of racial vision in the Second World War, overlapping with kind of ideas of photographic humanism, which people will be familiar with, and the international institutions that were emerging in that period, seeing the medium of photography, not just photography, of course, but seeing the medium of photography as a means of kind of disseminating a particular kind of image of the world. So that's kind of there's a set of connections there with the US work that kind of go beyond the singular kind of project of projects of the US Information Agency. Of course, one of the most important contexts here is that this is the Cold War period. Of course, we tend to think of that in terms of the kind of bipolar relation between the US and the Soviet Union. My particular focus has been on the kind of African connection with that, and often, certainly in part of that period, Africa was seen as a kind of place where there was kind of competition. Certainly, that's for some of the period that I kind of been researching. There was competition over kind of media and over imagery in terms of kind of dissemination from the Soviet Union, from the US into Africa. It was seen as wrongly, in many ways, as a kind of vacuum into which kind of media seen from the US perspective as a vacuum into which Soviet kind of media and visual imagery and so on was being kind of drawn, and that the US had to respond to that. So there is some elements of competition in that. The particular focus of this talk is, and the images I'm going to show you really relate to civil rights. And I think it's kind of recognized now that the civil rights movement, and that, not just the imagery, but certainly the imagery was part of that, presented a kind of challenge for US foreign policy, presented a challenge to the idea of US democracy, or the image of US democracy. So that's kind of another kind of broad context for thinking about this imagery. It was part of and intended to address a kind of that kind of challenge to the US's image across the world. So it has to be kind of seen in that context. And you can think of that as propaganda, and to some extent it is propaganda, but I also think we can think of, we can use other ways to think of it that go beyond the sort of the specifics of what we mean by propaganda. In terms of framing this, theoretically, methodologically, I talk about in the book something, well, I sort of refer to it as a photography of relations. And what I mean by that, I mean, you know, in some ways, if you think back to US government photography in the period before this, it was very much focused on the US itself. And we think of the Farm Security Administration as being the most obvious element. It was about understanding the US. It was about recording different parts of the US. The photography that emerges in this post-war period is very much about US relations with other countries and very much about picturing those. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, the different kind of ways of picturing. But that has been for me a kind of central idea for thinking about this set of images that I've been working with. Methodologically, I've been working with kind of large numbers of photographs, but also probably many more documents. The way in which I research is, I mean, I am interested in the images and analyzing the images, but I'm also interested in understanding the organization of the work of photography, how projects come to be conceived and executed, how images come to be, made, but also how they, the routes along which they travel, the ways in which they're put together with kind of text and other images, and the ways in which they arrive in front of people who see them either in print form or in exhibition form. So I'm kind of, thinking about that whole kind of construction of kind of photographic work and photographic production and photographic distribution. And I kind of draw on ideas from James Hevier's idea of the photography complex, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, but also the idea of coming from kind of anthropologists working in photography like Elizabeth Edwards, about this kind of the social nature of photographs, the way in which photographs act and mediate between people. So I think that's an important part of how I think about the photographs kind of methodologically. Sorry. So I'll say a little bit about the US Information Agency. I hope I'm not kind of stating the obvious. Some of you will know more and some of you may know less about the US Information Agency. It was government agency founded in 1953, and it comes out of what's known as the Smith-Mundt Act of 48, which was about kind of putting information, cultural and education programs in the service of US foreign policy. And to quote from the Act, it was about promoting better understanding of the US in other countries and to increase the mutual understanding between the people of the US and the people of other countries. So that's centrally what the USIA was about. It did that through numerous means, and photography is only one of those, and arguably not even the most important. It's the one I've focused on, it's the one I'm interested in. But USIA was also produced film, it produced radio. Voice of America was the US Information Agency's radio production. It ran educational things in activities in foreign countries. It supplied press with information. It ran exhibitions. It had cultural centers across across multiple countries. And as I say, my focus has been particularly on Africa, but of course the US Information Agency worked across the world. So this is, I'm kind of slicing it both in terms of medium and also in terms of the particular part of the world I'm most interested in. Although many of the images I'll show you in a moment, went beyond Africa. Some of them were specifically for African distribution. Some were for global distribution. The image you can see, which is on the cover of the book, this is a delegation from Guinea visiting the grave of John F. Kennedy shortly after the assassination. So this would have been an image that would have been produced in Washington for sending out probably to Guinea and other countries in West Africa, but it's unlikely to have traveled further than that. But a number of the images around civil rights were kind of spread much more widely than that. Photography was an important part of the program. It's not as I say, not the only medium that USIA was working with, and some might argue that radio was more important, but nevertheless, Leonard Marks, one of the directors in the mid-60s, talked about photography as a vital asset, and working with cultural producers, photographers, creative practitioners, as a way of doing this work of promoting understanding of the US. I would also think it's important to place the government photography of the USIA in the period I'm talking about in relation to those earlier iterations. There is both continuity, but also some significant differences between the work of the Farm Security Administration and the Office of War Information. In very kind of practical terms, some of the images that were being produced in Washington and elsewhere in the kind of 50s and 60s were using the same darkroom facilities as the FSA were using in the 1930s. That said, the model of photographic production was quite different. This wasn't, high-profile photographers given months on end to travel and produce the kind of bodies of work we saw come out of the 1930s photography. It was a very much more disciplined, constrained kind of production model. Photographers, the agency had staff photographers. They were often working on very short-term assignments. The agency did also commission photographers, particularly so stuff in Washington and New York would typically have been done by a staff photographer. Anything beyond that would often be commissioning local photographers in other parts of the US. So important to remember that, to think about that continuity. This is, if you want to know what happened to, what started in the FSA in the 1930s, it went into the Office of War Information. Post-war, when the Office of War Information closed down, all of that photography activity was still within the Department of State, and it pops out into the US Information Agency in 1953 when that becomes a kind of independent agency in its own right. But as I say, quite a changed thing over that period. I'll just say a little bit more. I mean, the idea of photography relations, I think, is kind of threefold. So it's about picturing those relations. The image that you can see there is about different national relations being pictured together. It's about performing those, and of course, this is a performance and a highly choreographed one. I don't think it's at all accidental that the head of the line of soldiers there, you've got an African-American soldier. But it's also about then the circulation of these as a token of relations, as a way of building US relationship with in this case, kind of new African nations overseas. I'm talking, the images I'm going to show shortly come from the USIA's record of civil rights protest, well, not protest, civil rights, not just protest. And I think, a lot of that would have been distributed globally. It wasn't just for Africa, but I think there's an argument from the evidence I've seen that to some extent, the way in which those images were produced was shaped in dialogue with the agency's desire to engage with newly independent African countries. You can see in the documents, in some of the debates going on within the agency, that the kind of the appeal to Africa, or the perceived need to appeal to Africa, was shaping understanding of how the agency was representing civil rights and issues of civil rights at home. So very briefly, before I go on and kind of talk through some of the kind of images and picture stories, as I said, civil rights was a public relations issue for the US on the world stage. The US was getting condemned for, things that were going on domestically, the kind of racial violence, discrimination, and so on. And this is relatively well known in the kind of sort of foreign policy literature. I'm not kind of making a new argument here that kind of international condemnation was to some extent a driver of domestic change. part of the pressure on civil rights in the US was because it damaged them internationally, damaged the country internationally in terms of its reputation. It's an argument made by Mary Dudziak in a book published in 2000, which I believe is going to be issued in a 25th anniversary edition this year. So as I said, I think, but nevertheless, despite that, I think you can argue that the engagement with Africa shaped to some degree the way in which the US was picturing, the US government and the US Information Agency was picturing race in the US. And what I want to talk through this evening are a number of different ways in which the agency did that. Three, what you might think of as sort of phases. They're not quite chronological in that they overlap, and I think you could find arguments at different points within the agency. This is quite a large, complex organization. Didn't always speak with one voice, but different approaches to how it was felt that the civil rights and the experience of African Americans should be represented in US photography. That really kind of evolves over what I'm thinking of as three broad kind of phases, or what I'll kind of show you as kind of brief three broad phases. Firstly, a kind of early approach of what I call picturing interracial harmony and progress. That the emphasis is really on, ideas of protest are not present, ideas of racial violence are not present at all in the kind of US government representations. At a certain point as we get into the 1960s, and you've got things like the Freedom Rides, you've got events such as Birmingham, Alabama. This becomes within the agency seen as a kind of untenable proposition, and that somehow there's a sense that actually the agency has to address protest. It has to address some of this, the kind of reality, if you like, of what's going on in relation to civil rights. So there is an effort to picture protest, to photograph events such as the March on Washington, but also to acknowledge some of the violence that was taking place. Obviously, this is a US government photography output. There are kind of parameters within which it worked and didn't wish to, wouldn't step beyond. But nevertheless, that's a kind of shift. It was a shift from the early phase where it was felt you didn't need to kind of deal with that at all. And then within the archive, there are some examples of, a very small number of examples of what I think of as kind of sort of exceptions to the rule, more what I think of as documentary versus propaganda. We can kind of discuss what I mean by that, but images possibly that weren't actually used or seen very widely, but an attempt to record some, a more grassroots civil rights activity than hitherto had really been recorded. And then concluding that, by the time you get to the later 60s, the emergence of Black Power, really there's a shift again, and the record of the photographic recording of civil rights protests is seen as almost a completed story, and the agency doesn't wish to engage with that any further. So I'm going to talk through those different elements. Okay, so let me just check on time. So as I said, I think the images I want to show you fall into those three broad kind of categories. This is the earliest kind of phase of that, which really from the mid-50s. I think you can go back further, and US government photography and US overseas public diplomacy still had to address these kind of questions, but it becomes more pressing in the mid-50s. And this is a statement from USI operating assumptions. It's not specific to photography, but there was very much a sense that you would picture the kind of positive stories, what seems progressive stories, and actually you would leave to kind of any textual commentary, anything that kind of was associated more with kind of violence and kind of racial conflict. So photographically, it's a sort of arbitrary, not quite an arbitrary starting point, but quite a nice kind of point to take for me. A kind of pamphlet produced in 1956, which is titled "An African Looks at the American Negro." This is It's probably one of the first times that kind of Africa gets kind of featured in the photographic output of USIA, except actually really there's not really very much about Africa in this kind of in this pamphlet at all. This is an African American couple on the front. The idea of the African looking is really just a kind of a device to suggest a kind of an affinity and a genuine kind of understanding of what is presented as a fairly kind of positive view of African American experience in the US and progress across multiple areas from employment to education and so on. But this is the kind of picture you see in the early mid-50s. So very positive images about different aspects of kind of African American success. So, African American workers. This is actually Courier magazine is UNESCO's magazine, but this is this particular issue of UNESCO's Courier is absolutely full of USIA images. They shared images through their office, would have been their office in Paris, that were USIA images. This is depicting a kind of African American, I think, as a surgeon. So presenting a very kind of positive picture for international audiences. I should have said in my research in the US, most of the materials in the US National Archives in College Park, where I've really kind of focused my attention, or at least the kind of series that were most useful to me were firstly the kind of what they call the staff and stringer files. So in a sense, the remnants of the photographic assignments that had been either commissioned internally or requested from overseas offices. And so you get a kind of mix of contact sheets, notes, sometimes correspondence, sometimes quite detailed photographic briefs. They're not quite gold dust, but there are not lots of them. But it allows you to reconstruct, not just to see the images, but or how they were used, but to reconstruct the kind of production and the thinking behind the need for the images. Excuse me. The second most useful series for me, what were called picture story files. These were packaged sets of images and captions and overview text that was sent to overseas offices. So they weren't fully fledged picture stories. Overseas press or overseas offices wanting to use these could use all of the images. They could use one of the images. They could use the captions that were provided. They could provide their own captions. They could translate captions. So it's a sort of semi-formed picture story that was adaptable to kind of multiple uses. This example is one of those, and it's a very typical kind of USIA picture story from this period. This is Harry Belafonte visiting what's called an integrated day camp. And so you got this kind of mix of African American, Hispanic, white American children, in a kind of positive environment. This was one of about 7 or 8 picture stories from that set. Again, this is a picture story of a small town African American doctor, the kind of the fact that he's working or treating white patients is part of the point of the story. It's not included in the captions anywhere, but if you kind of read the kind of context for the production of the story, this is what the agency was looking to picture. Remember, they're picturing this not for American audiences, but for international audiences. So again, these are actually students here, kind of always the emphasis on kind of integrated settings, integrated images is, comes through all of these, or, large number of these picture stories. Again, the image on the left actually is taken at Karamu House, which still exists in Cleveland. But again, the requests were always for images of integrated images, picturing in typically in really kind of positive contexts. Picturing the progress of so successful African American either business people or cultural figures. So the person on the left is a African American fashion designer, and I've just clipped a little bit from the kind of shooting script for that, which requests him at work with 2 or 3 of his workers, and then specifying that they should be both white and African American workers. So the importance of that to the kind of story. I think the figure on the right is a student working in a kind of press office. I have to, top of my head, I'm not precisely sure where those were taken, but again, young African American success story. Both, so you've got educational, you've got cultural. These are also kind of political figures. So this is a local mayor, some working in kind of local councils. Again, pictured, not necessarily the most exciting photographs often, but pictured for international audiences to appear, to be promoted in offices overseas, to be distributed to kind of local press in overseas contexts, to offset the idea that kind of the US was an oppressive place for African Americans. Here, Captain Edward Dwight, the first African American astronaut candidate, never actually got to go in space, and there are several books on his experience and who blocked him at certain points. But this is a sort of gift of a story for the US Information Agency. Again, this is an image selected from a longer picture story that had about 6 or 7 images with captions that would have been sent to multiple overseas offices. This wouldn't have just been Africa. This would have gone everywhere, this one. You can see here the kind of, if I was lucky enough, I found kind of shooting scripts that, well, commissioning sheets. This is it's not quite a shooting script, but it's a kind of brief for this for this assignment. I don't expect you to read it. It's not easy to read even with the actual copy. But this tells me a number of things. Firstly, it tells me who's asking for this work, which allows me to understand that this is being this set of images being requested by the Africa office, the Central Africa office in the Washington, or the Africa branch in the Washington office of USIA, particularly looking for images showing African Americans at the gravesite of Kennedy. And this, I clipped you a little bit there, but there's a long, the kind of block of text in the middle is a description of how important it is to have an African American serviceman, to see him in relation to other white servicemen, and this is then an image that will be distributed to African offices to counteract, if you like, the kind of imagery that's being circulated in the press about America not being kind of a place in which African Americans can progress. So it's a kind of kind of counter imagery without being necessarily explicit about that. I think very obviously in these images, there's a kind of images that are speaking to, this is a period when we've got the lunch counter protests, and these images are speaking to that whole question of kind of people eating together. They're just, without being explicit about kind of civil rights protest, these are counter images to those other images that are circulating internationally. And again, there's kind of connections with African dimension. So African visitors to America, I think the guy on the right is from Kenya, are pictured eating with kind of host families in the US. I mean, it's a very straightforward picture of someone eating together, but when you position it in relation to the other images that were circulating, you kind of understand what's going on here. And there are kind of, this is a strategy really that kind of reached a number of limits. The first of which was, the things going on in the US in the early 60s that were being recorded and distributed internationally meant that strategy really no longer kind of seemed credible, I think. The other thing is that the US, the agency was commissioning photographers to go back and photograph a small number of places that kind of they felt would be able to present a kind of integrated story. And this is taken from kind of Little Rock was obviously significant in 57. The agency sent photographers back there quite frequently to say how great things were post 1957 and the Little Rock crisis. But that didn't always go well. And this is, really in some ways quite shocking kind of quotation from the photographer's notes on an African American student not wishing to be part of this kind of photographic production. I could talk more about that, but I'm conscious that time is moving on, so I'm going to move on. So by the early 60s, it was clear that, this is just a wonderful quote. It will take many pictures of less exciting sweetness and light subjects to dent the impact of a single shot of flesh-tearing police dogs. Essentially, the strategy really wasn't offsetting the kinds of images that were circulating internationally. So there was a sense within the agency, I'm not sure everyone agreed with the approach, but that actually there needed to be greater acknowledgement of these kinds of images. These are obviously not USIA images, but these were the kind of images that were being seen by international audiences and were informing their view of what the US was like. But you begin to see in this period the US Information Agency commissioning. This is someone commissioned to photograph the funeral of Medgar Evers. This is, quite explicit acknowledgement of kind of racial violence. Interestingly, when you look at how it's pictured, I don't think there's any surprise here that the image at the bottom, you've got an African-American serviceman and a white serviceman flanking the mourners here. That would have been quite deliberate and chosen quite deliberately. You've got the Medgar Evers' widow, which appears to be an image that was selected for printing. I have to say I haven't seen any of these images used in a published context, so I'm not sure if they were used or not, or quite where they were circulated. Sometimes that information is with the material, and sometimes it isn't. You also see in this period a kind of effort to present a sense of kind of US federal kind of activity on civil rights. So this comes from a picture story on desegregation and the efforts that the Department of Justice is making towards desegregation. So this is a desegregation map, putting flags in in public facilities that have been desegregated. So an effort to show internationally that kind of the US government was in charge of, was kind of making progress, was pursuing a kind of desegregation strategy. And again, so this is James Meredith meeting with Robert F. Kennedy. And interestingly, I think there's also some triangulation goes on with work in relation to Africa, because you've got around the same period, you've got images, almost the same kind of images in the same kind of setting, with Kennedy meeting African leaders such as Kenneth Kaunda. So there's a kind of sense of triangulating perspectives, and for African audiences who are concerned about kind of civil rights in the US, there's a kind of a sense of a shared kind of commitment. And yeah, so this is another sort of, this is less civil rights in a way, but this is Miriam Makeba, South African exile, who did become a campaigner for civil rights in the US. These were the kind of stories that the agency was beginning to focus on in order to appeal to newly independent African audiences, and to present to them a picture of, in this case, also support for anti-apartheid, kind of hedging its bets in many ways, whilst also kind of speaking to kind of civil rights concerns. Began to picture African-American civil rights leaders. In the earlier period, there was some coverage of African-American civil rights leaders, but this kind of really ramps up in this period. And begins to be a sense that actually it was okay to picture protest, and that hadn't been the case before. Protest was seen as a problem, whereas it becomes to be narrated in terms of a kind of, not a solution, but as part of the mix, a part of the way in which American democracy was working. And so you've got the agency covers quite extensively the March on Washington, produces a series of 2 or 3 full picture stories that are distributed internationally. This is an image from one of those, always picturing protest, or actually not always is probably going too far, but trying in the main to picture protest as also integrated. So it's African-American protesters with white protesters. It's not a segregated form of protest. The idea is that kind of there's a collective opposition. And this is quite an interesting, comes from quite an interesting picture story, where you've got these paired images, which are almost offering a before-after, suggesting that protest leads to kind of change, which is highly unusual for US government to kind of present things in that way at this point. So swimming pool protests, integrated swimming pool. Of course, these are in very different locations, but nevertheless, the narrative is quite clear. And picturing African-American civil rights leaders at the heart of government. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on to the last section I wanted to talk about, because we do want to leave some time for questions, and Tom will stop me in a moment if I carry on talking. There are a few stories in that 1963-64 period, which I think don't quite fit either narrative, and I haven't really seen any of these used anywhere, where the agency begins to picture more grassroots civil rights activism and leaders that would not be their typical face that they want to present. So, I mean, Martin Luther King fell in and out of favor, but tended to be, a certain version of Martin Luther King was something that the agency felt was useful for them to promote abroad. They produced a number of kind of photo stories. They produced a significant, well-produced pamphlet in the wake of his assassination that was distributed internationally. But they also began to photograph, so there was some integrated kind of camp activities that were photographed. This possibly might fit with earlier stuff, but I think actually there's a more genuine kind of documentary work going on here. But also picturing some of the figures here, activists who'd been in prison in the South, connecting with other civil rights groups in I think in New York State, actually, these images. picturing leaders such as Bob Moses, James Foreman, who had a very different kind of perspective. And also recording, although they didn't record, they didn't send photographers to cover the kind of Freedom Summer. They did commission a photographer to cover some of the kind of preparations for that, and this image comes from that. And well, I can speak more about that image if we like. By the later 60s, there's that disappears. You've obviously got civil rights legislation is passed, and from a government point of view, there's a sense of wanting to treat the problem as finished. And you know, Black Power, the kind of, whilst Martin Luther King could be kind of integrated into a US government narrative, it's sort of unlikely that Stokely Carmichael or kind of others would be equally. So there's a kind of change again of the narrative in the late 60s, and the photography of of civil rights activity kind of drops off. It's kind of like, maybe we should. There are always people who argue that there should be less of it, but this becomes the kind of winning argument in the late 60s. So I think I'm going to finish there. Otherwise, we won't have time for questions. Apologies for talking longer than my time, Tom.
Not at all, Darren. Thanks very much. That was fascinating. Cheers. Thank you from everybody here for that really interesting insight. Right, I'm going to stop the recording now and we'll move to the Q&A session.